Hello, everybody. We're back. 6:03 p.m. Sorry to keep you waiting. We're excited for our next guest, and I now have Jean Spellman with me. She's from the Paciello group, so we are reunited once again. And she'll be with me for the next 2 hours. And Jean is going to do an introduction of our next guest. So take it away, Jean.
All right. Well, I'm very pleased to introduce Birkir Gunnarsson. I first met Birkir at a CSUN conference a couple of years ago, I think. It was with Lucy Greco talking to me about Blind Accessibility Testers Society. And that acronym tells me a lot about Birkir's sense of humor. It was a fun breakfast, we had a lot of laughs, and we had a deep dive discussion of accessibility testing issues. You should all read Birkir's speaker description on the inclusivedesign24.org website. It's quite funny. I wouldn't do it justice. But Birkir has degrees in computer science and economics from Yale, has spent years of experience working in the financial industry before moving full-time to accessibility. He's recently spent 3 years at DQ and is currently at BB&T Bank. All that in addition to being an accessibility Viking. I'm looking forward to hearing what he has to say about ARIA 51, when a powerful standard is used wrong.
All right. Thank you, everybody. I hope you can hear me. And let me start by apologizing to the unfortunate people that have to caption this talk. And if it's turned into ASL, that might be even worse because a very bad attempt at punning and wordplay that may not translate very well. But it amused me while I was writing it, and I tried to amuse myself, and I hope I can amuse you too. All right. Unfortunately, I'm suffering from some blindness issues, being blind myself. Apparently, if I try to screen share, my PowerPoint slide cuts off, and it looks all weird. So I'm going to ask people to run the slide with me, and I'll tell them to flip. So you don't have to translate the flip commands. All right, let's flip over to slide 2. By the way, this is a very movie-themed thing. I don't know why. It just sometimes movie themes happen. So, Liar Liar, this is one of my favorite Jim Carrey movies. Actually, I only like about 2 of them. There are movies that I don't like. And the point of this slide is the problem with ARIA, and also the beautiful thing about ARIA, is ARIA overrides native semantics. If you use an ARIA role or attribute, be it a label or whatever, if the HTML element has a native name, label, attribute, functionality, well, functionality not, but role and description gets overridden by ARIA. Incidentally, I put a little code example there that tries to convince you that I am the Queen of England. And of course, I am royal. I do this by putting role equals Queen of England and ARIA royal equals true. Needless to say, these are actually not real ARIA attributes, at least not yet. Though we have talked about more customization of ARIA. And I guess before I dive deeper in, I'll give you a really quick background of my ARIA experience. As a screen reader user, I'm really curious about ARIA, playing with the latest and greatest in the standard, thinking about how we can make it better, how we can make it more exciting. I had the opportunity to work on the ARIA working group and ARIA authoring practices group for a while. Unfortunately, when I transferred to BB&T, I became a member of a large corporation, and the $80,000 membership fees is something I was a little bit worried about asking about on the first year. So hopefully I'll get to join next year. But I keep a close eye on it. I do a lot of ARIA kind of playing around. I built it into our widgets and complex components that will be rolled out to various parts of BB&T's websites. And I'm really excited about seeing things that are happening in ARIA. So without further ado of my background, because it's not overly exciting, let's flip to the meat of this presentation on slide 3. And continuing with the movie theme here, because I don't know why, but I decided to frame it as the 7 deadly sins of ARIA. That being said, many of these sins are not quite that deadly. The effects of the quote-unquote sins, by sins here, I really just mean things that developers do wrong when they try to use ARIA. Sometimes the effect on the user is devastating. They can practically ruin the whole page experience. But some of these are more minor quirks, things that confuse or things that just don't validate. So as we flip through these sins, I will describe the severity of each sin. let's move over to Sin 1. I really like that one because that gave me the chance to do a lot of bad wordplay. So Sin 1 is Littony. What is Littony? Well, it's not an English word. Well, there is an English word, but it's spelled slightly differently. But this is a very common ARIA pattern that I've seen. This is where people put role equals button on a typical link and think they're done. They think, oh, now I've fully mapped this link as a button. Point is that, yes, if you're a screen reader user, this is announced as a button. This is more or less functions as a button. You can focus it, and you can use the enter key to activate it. But there are aspects of it that don't really function fully like a button, like if you use the button element. That includes being able to press the spacebar to activate the button. In fact, if you do, if a keyboard-only user, you will scroll the page, and the focus will move to the top of the page if you use the typical href equals hashtag sign. And it is a minor annoyance, but and people can talk about it forever, whether how bad it is, how serious it is. In my point of view, it is usable by the user, which is what matters ultimately compares to a lot of the other problems we'll see later. However, it's still not good practice. If you map something as an ARIA role and you tell something is a button, tell the users it's a button, then you have to back up your promise and implement it fully as a button. And like I put on the slide, the outcome of turning a link into a button is what I call an alien life form that looks like an illegitimate child between a link and a button. Here, have some fun. I like calling it a butt because it's a button, but it's missing a little bit of the functionality of a button. So a butt seems appropriate. Like I said earlier, the final bullet really just emphasizes the fact that using ARIA, you are promising the user that something works a certain way, but it becomes your responsibility to make sure it works that way, because otherwise you're letting the user down. And in fact, if people see these slides and they're really bored, we had a whole session, me and my DQ colleague last year, we had a lot of famous accessibility people discuss about 10 different scenarios, whether things should be links or buttons. And it was an interesting discussion, but it's somewhat, I don't know, somewhat advanced and maybe a little bit too narrow for the interest of a lot of people. Don't spend too much time on it. Okay, flipping to the next one. Here, I had to do a little bit more wordplay for my own amusement. Sputtony is a really bad problem. That's where you turn a span into a button without implementing any functionality. That means you can click it with a mouse, but it's not announced as a button. You can't activate it with a keyboard. You can't focus it with a keyboard. It's bad. And my favorite, lickboxing, which is turning a link into a checkbox. It's a sport. I don't recommend it, but I've seen it quite a lot. When you do that, you can check and uncheck the checkbox with the enter key, but users never expect that. A checkbox is checkable with the spacebar. This is why you have to honor that commitment and then functionality to the user. So these are kind of examples of quite common examples, things that I've seen in my assessments through the years of how ARIA is misused, or an element is mapped as a different ARIA role, but people don't really back up the promise of the full functionality. Moving to the second sin. I call it dislabeling as another kind of wordplay. It basically mislabeling elements for people with disabilities, so that is assistive technology users. How does this tie back into ARIA? Well, you can label elements using ARIA, either ARIA label or ARIA label by, and whatever you name it with those ARIA attributes is going to replace or override any other source of what we call the accessible name. So if you properly labeled something, say a form field with your HTML label tag, but then for some inexplicable reason you decided to use ARIA labeling because you thought it made it even more accessible. If you did it wrong, then the poor element ends up with no name at all, or a bad name. For examples of this, let's flip over to the next slide. This would be slide 7. And I have 2 examples here. I've seen instances of both of these problems happen quite a few times. The first one is when ARIA label by either just points to a missing ID, one element with a missing ID, or people misunderstand ARIA label by and say, oh, ARIA label by equals whatever text I want. So looking at the first example, you have the label is first name, but somebody wants to be extremely helpful to a poor screen reader user and puts ARIA label by equals, please enter your first name. Well, most users know there's an edit field. They're expected to enter text into it, so this is not a good practice to begin with. And it makes it even worse because the poor developer, which is hypothetical, of course, used the wrong attribute, used ARIA labeled by. ARIA labeled by expects an ID attribute. So what does a browser/screen reader do in this case? It looks for an attribute on the web page that has the ID, please enter your name. Such an ID is not going to be on the web page. And the poor element basically ends up without an accessible name, which is a violation and often causes a lot of problems because the screen reader is not going to announce anything. When you focus this with the screen reader, it'll probably just say edit or input, and you have no idea what you're supposed to input. And the other example, which you flip on to slide 8, is use of ARIA label. ARIA label is basically what the hypothetical developer intended to use on the first slide. He incidentally used ARIA label by instead, which was wrong. So ARIA label works as advertised, but ARIA label equals the text that you want to be announced. In this situation, and I've seen this actually happen, people think ARIA label is additional information that will help a screen reader user. So you're thinking, well, in this case, we have a legit label for the field. Who's your favorite childhood superhero? Mine was Curious George. I'm not sure if it's a superhero, but I like them anyway. But somebody thought, okay, I'm going to help the user again and put ARIA labels equals answer. And again, I've actually seen this happen. It was, I think, a sign-up form for some website evaluated a while back. Of course, I would never let this happen on @bbnt.com or any of his affiliates. But what happens here is, well, the screen reader user, because whatever you put into the ARIA label string is going to override the native label, the screen reader user is going to focus his field and it's going to hear answer, edit. Answer what? Well, he's not going to hear the question. The user can figure it out by looking around, but you did a major boo-boo here because you overwrote the valid name with the ARIA label unnecessarily. And the second example is really just kind of another thing that I've often seen is that, and understandably, the standards that people use to edit, to evaluate text that visually hidden, they often just plain miss it. It usually doesn't go through the same editorial reviews. And I very frequently see misspelled words, bad grammar, and so on in visually hidden text, and especially ARIA label text. So this is just an example, somewhat exaggerated, of what could happen. But I've often seen that, and this is bad for screen reader users because a screen reader has basically a dictionary of words, and when words are misspelled, they can completely butcher them and make it difficult to interact with the field. So these are basically examples of the fact, again, that ARIA gives the developer a lot of power, and the developer doesn't quite know how to use it properly, so they go ahead, well-intentioned, I'm sure, but they ruin the user experience. These are problems that the user can recover from by looking around and figuring things out, but they shouldn't have to do that. Let's move on to the third sin, and I call it anti-semanticism. This is the practice of using ARIA to destroy semantically meaningful elements. And this is something that happens quite frequently, and ARIA is, let's just face it, ARIA is complicated, so I understand why this would happen. Well-meaning people just try to use ARIA and they end up using it incorrectly. And what's the problem? Well, if you assign an ARIA role to an element, again, it overwrites whatever the element's native semantics is, how you coded it. In this case, I put a button and I put role equals heading. If you see it, it's a button. If you interact with it, it's a button. You can focus it, you can click it, it works with the keyboard. Only you tell the screen reader user it's a heading. And a user that knows that you don't click a heading is not interactive, so they may not even try to click this thing. And this is dangerous use of ARIA roles. This is somewhat simplistic because this particular thing hardly ever happens. But there's another more complicated case version of this that actually is more understandable why people fail to do it correctly and has a much bigger user impact, and that is using ARIA container roles whose children are presentational, representing your children. Okay, to explain what that is, let's flip over to the next slide. So here's the spec definition. I'm not going to read it out. It's long and it's a little bit complicated. But there are certain roles for ARIA. I don't list them here. They're all in the spec. You can look in the spec and you can look at a little table for each role description. And if it's the children are presentational, it's going to say children presentational true. What does that mean? That means if you have elements that have semantic elements inside the element that you are applying the role to, all those elements will disappear, and the only thing that's left is the text. So, for example, if you had a heading and a table inside a button, you'll hear all the text that was in this heading in this table, but you cannot navigate to it because it's no longer a heading. You cannot explore it as a table because it's not a table. It's a button with a lot of text in it. And this actually, I've seen really bad applications, the wrong applications of this, causing pages to become almost unusable. And if you flip to slide 11, the primary problem I've seen with this is people that misunderstand the meanings of tab, the roles tab and tab panel. And with good intent, they put role equals tab on what we call a tab panel. A tab panel is the content that contains all the interactive elements and text, headings, and so on that are associated with a tab. What happens? Well, this whole element structure gets flattened out, all the semantic elements are removed, and you are left with the text and the word tab. And here I show a little example of transactions form for a bank. I've actually experienced as a user a while back with one of the banks I'm doing my personal business with. I tried to look at my transaction history. The page had been updated, and somebody added role equals tab to the tab panel for it. At least with JAWS, I can't remember if MEDA had the same problem, but I was not able to enter any text. I wasn't able to force forms mode and enter text into these form fields. And so I was basically completely unable to use the page. All of this because the developer put role equals tab instead of tab panel. If he had just left this fancy stuff out and just used plain HTML, it would have been just fine. I would have been able to use it. However, if the developer had done it correctly, it would actually be a much better experience for me. It's more dynamic, easier to locate, easier to understand it. So again, we can never talk about it often enough that if ARIA is done well, it's used appropriately, it can do wonders for the assistive technology user experience. It can really elevate it to another level. On the flip side, if it's done incorrectly, you can really leave your assistive technology users in a ton of people trouble. Moving on to sin number 4. This is exciting. And erroneous error notifications. Here I had to make a reference to Iron Maiden. This is one of my more feeble puns. It's actually the only famous rock stars I ever met was Iron Maiden. That was back in the 1992 Barcelona Olympics, and actually still have a VIP ticket with Bruce Dickinson's signature on it, which is pretty cool. So I had to throw Iron Maiden in there, even if the spelling is wrong. Going back to the topic at hand. What is this and why is this happening? Well, this is another kind of peculiar at first sight functionality of ARIA, and this is ARIA described by. You use that to point to from an element to an element that describes it. So in this case, this is the most frequent usage for it. If a form field has either a tooltip with instructions on how to operate it or an error message, you put ARIA described by on the form field, and it points to the ID of the element that gives it the context. That context can be a tooltip, but it can't be an error. So this all looks fine and dandy, but there is this one peculiarity with ARIA described by and incidentally ARIA labeled by. That is that they ignore CSS settings. Particularly, they ignore the CSS class display none. And why is this a problem? Let's move on to slide 13. Well, so developers thinking, okay, I want to do things right here for accessibility. What they do is they have the error messages already prepackaged and ready in the static HTML of the page. When it loads, they just hide it using CSS display none because, well, it's not relevant. The user hasn't even tried to enter the form. So to be very helpful, they provide the correct connection between the form field and the error message right away because they know what the IDs are, they're ready, and they think, okay, once this error message is displayed, the user is going to hear it, the user is going to recover quickly, and I've done my accessibility correctly, and it's awesome. But what's the problem? Problem is that when you reference something with ARIA described by, the browser doesn't care how you hit it or whether you hit it. It's always going to be announced. So the user opens the page, user starts interacting with the forms, move a screen reader, you move focus to the form, and the screen reader starts reading that there are all these error messages with every form. You're like, what the heck? I didn't even start filling this form in. Why am I hearing all this stuff? And that's why. Basically, with ARIA described by, you have to be really careful only to add it when it's relevant, especially when you use it for error messages. You can only add the ID of the error message and add ARIA described by to the form field when the error message is actually visible. This is one thing that has tripped up a lot of developers, and it is, I understand it, it's a little too difficult. We should have made it easier for developers to reliably display error messages and make sure they're only announced when they're visible. ARIA described by pointing to hidden elements makes a lot of sense for tooltips because users always need to hear tooltips. And this ensures that the screen readers will announce them even if maybe there's a problem with the hover state or whatever. But for error messages, this kind of didn't work out. And the ARIA working group, I mean, it was realized that this wasn't the best way to do it. So now we have a new proposed mechanism called ARIA error message. It works exactly like ARIA described by, except there's an additional attribute on the field called ARIA invalid. And only when that attribute is set to true should the assistive technology announce the error message, even if it's connected from the beginning. This makes it a little bit easier for the developer to control when an error message is announced by a screen reader and make sure that it's in sync with when it is visible and therefore when it's applicable to all users. So again, this ARIA described by, this is a very commonly encountered problem. This is not an absolute killer for the user. Users can work around it, but it does provide a very awkward user experience. And I'm glad that we moved away from it. The support for ARIA error message is not quite there yet, but as we all know, it's an evolving standard, and I'm excited to try it out and hopefully use it in the next year, maybe 18 months. And moving on to sin number 5. And 6:30, we're more or less on time. And I call it Overplaying the Accordion. Here, I really wanted to insert some really bad accordion music that I have in my music library. When I publish this as an article, which I plan to do that as a blog post with actual working examples, everything I talk about here, I will probably provide a link out to some horrible accordion music. You do not have to click it if you don't want to, be warned. So there are indicators that are extremely useful, actually some of my favorite ones in ARIA, and that's when dynamic content is displayed or hidden, or when buttons or elements, well, particularly buttons, change their state. This is something that you cannot really easily explain or use or describe using a typical HTML elements. How does it work? When you have what we call an accordion control, you have a link that you can click to, we call it expand or collapse the accordion. That just means show or hide a block of content on the page. That's great. So the way we do it, we put on the controlling element, which is here as a link, it could be a button. Let's not go into discussions about which one it should be. In fact, it should be a button. But ARIA expanded is false, means that the content is available if you click this. And if you click it, the ARIA expanded will turn into true. Most, say, screen readers announce this as This particular link would say terms and conditions collapsed. This means that that clicking it will expand something. When you click it, it will announce it as expanded. The problem is that developers tend to overuse ARIA expanded and put it on a couple of places at once. I think this is either a jQuery or Bootstrap library issue, because I think that's where it's coming from. So the ARIA expanded gets added both to the link and to a span inside the link. I have no idea why that happens, but this causes really awkward screen reader announcement of it. Usually the screen reader will end up saying terms and conditions expanded. And it's even worse when you click it, because sometimes they only update one of them. So it's going to say terms and conditions expanded collapsed. And screen reader user is thinking, what the hell? Is it expanded or collapsed? I don't know. And a kind of related thing, using the ARIA expanded attribute and using a title attribute as well. We used to have to do this quite a bit until VoiceOver for iOS, I believe version 8.4. Up to that version, ARIA expanded was not supported. So as I'm kind of backfilling it, we always had to use a title attribute and ARIA expanded together. And we also had to make sure that developers toggle both of them, because it would be equally awkward if all of a sudden VoiceOver started supporting the link and it might say something like terms and conditions expand, because it didn't update the title attribute. So you got these double announcements. Again, this is confusing. It's not the end of the world, but it is pretty awkward to the user. We went on to another version of this, and you can see an example of it actually on Google Hangouts next time. And that is the mute button. We have an ARIA attribute called ARIA press that turns the button into what we call a toggle button, basically a button you can switch on and off. So the way that the mute button is coded on Google Hangouts is, in its regular state, it's an ARIA pressed equals false, and the text is mute. So yeah, it makes sense. It's a mute button. You're not muted, so this is accurate. However, when you press it, not one thing happens, but two. ARIA press gets set to true, and they change the text to unmute. What you hear as a screen reader user now is unmute button pressed. I'm not exactly sure what that means. Does it mean that I am unmuted, or what? So this is kind of the double negative. This is like the equivalent of I'm not going to not do this. And it's confusing. You have to make sure that if you use these dynamic toggle indicators, that you don't change the text too, because then you basically create contradictions. So yeah, this is not too common, but I've seen developers mess this up quite a bit. And well, it's right there on Google Hangouts. And there's some pretty smart people at Google, and they still got it wrong. So it could happen anywhere. Moving on to thing number 6. ARIA prefixation. This hardly ever makes it out to websites, at least if people run any kind of tools or consult with an expert, but not everybody does that. But there's this little kind of peculiarity about the ARIA specification is when you use an ARIA attribute, they call it property of state. It starts with the ARIA dash. So ARIA dash label, ARIA dash hidden. But when you want to apply an ARIA role, you use the word role, not ARIA dash role. And I've quite frequently, when people are getting like using ARIA for the first time, they're kind of confused. They think just using ARIA makes everything accessible. You don't really have to think about it. So they add the attribute ARIA dash role to elements. Of course, that is just not a valid attribute. The browser doesn't do anything with it. The screen reader or assistive technology doesn't do anything with it either. If you run your page through an HTML validator, which people should do, too few people do it, unfortunately. I wish more people did. That would uncover a lot of headaches. But yeah, it will show up, at least with ARIA-aware validators, like the new validator and new validator from W3C, which I love it. And I really always point all our developers now to validate their pages with it. There was some grumbling initially, but we are really getting good results from establishing that process, and all of a sudden our pages are just beginning to work a lot better. So again, this doesn't really affect the user too badly, but it kind of, yeah, it's unnecessary. If you're going to use an ARIA attribute, read this back and make sure you use the right thing. And the last, and this is kind of I don't know, what you call it, the capital sin, but this is really the underlying thing of use of ARIA is you have to know when to use it, and more importantly, when not to use it. This is a key point because as a developer, as a designer, as anybody, you start by having a choice. You have an HTML element, say a button or a chat box or a radio button. It offers all the accessibility that you want, all the accessibility that you need. And you can validate it perfectly using tools. If there's problems, a tool can point it out for you. But if you instead decide to build your own because it's cool, or, well, there are sometimes legitimate issues. Like, it's really hard to make radio buttons look good. It used to be really hard to style buttons the way that people wanted to due to browser compatibility and default styling. Fortunately, that's changing. But there are reasons. But if you make a conscious decision to avoid the HTML element and build your own with ARIA, then you really do become responsible for doing it correctly. You cannot build a button with a span, test it with a mouse, think you look cool, and think you're done because you made a conscious choice not to use the button element. So this is where I really feel we often talk about it, and we presented on last year that accessibility is not just the developer's fault. Accessibility relies on the developer writing the valid code, on the browser parsing that code, on the system technology understanding the browser, and on the user being able to interact with the whole thing. That is okay, and I agree that sometimes the developer does the right thing, but the rest, the browser or the assistive technology, lets the user down, and it's their responsibility to fix it. However, if the developer could have used a perfectly valid HTML element that supported everywhere to begin with, and they make a decision not to do it, the developer becomes a lot more responsible. So this is kind of a clear line that I always preach. If you use ARIA, really think carefully whether you could have used the HTML first. There are valid reasons, in which case you really have to make sure you provide all the states, properties, accessible name, and functionality that the user expects. And this kind of goes to one of my last points, is when does ARIA really shine? It really, really does a lot of things. It shines when it provides functionality that HTML cannot. I love it for indicative selection indication. There's a new attribute called ARIA current that can do that. And for grouping, if you have things that are visually grouped, you can use the group role and a div and ARIA label to provide the context. I really like ARIA landmark regions that tell you how the page looks, what is the main content, what is the sidebar, what is this, what is that. You can do it reliably using ARIA regions. It's easy. So these cases, ARIA really shines, and also dynamic notification when content gets displayed or hidden or a dialog pops up. This is where ARIA shines. Where it doesn't shine is when you try to simulate a fully normal checkbox and button and radio button with all of these complicated ARIA elements and attributes. And where are we headed with this? Well, there are HTML5 attributes that are, for example, dialog. There's kind of a mini construct. There's a couple of really exciting HTML5 things. Oh, autocomplete search. I forgot that one. But right now, the browser support is just not there. In the meantime, we can try to use those, but they're just not accessible at all. So we really have to roll our own and use ARIA to make it happen. And since we're pretty much on time, we can flip over to slide 18. And here's one of my favorite movies, is a spoof of the movie Speed. And there's a nice screenshot of Ray Charles driving a bus. And that's kind of what I'm saying. We don't want to hand a blind person the key to a bus, but when we use ARIA and we tell the developers to use ARIA, we're basically handing them the keys to the blind user experience. We can blame them if you don't do it correctly, although they really should think twice and consult the right people before you do it. And moving on to slide 19. Here's basically why using ARIA is hard. Honestly, the specification, it's not simple. It's a little bit complex, sometimes a little bit too complex. We have to work on simplifying it in future versions, clarifying points, maybe adding more examples. Then there's the support with browser and system technologies. Sometimes it's inconsistent how they behave, sometimes it's even missing. There's nothing there. You could do all the right thing, but the user does not benefit from it because the support is missing. And it's really hard for the developer to visualize the experience, to understand what the ARIA is doing, because ARIA only works in the background. It's never visible in the browser. Fortunately, Brian Garaventa, one of the guys that really got me into accessibility and was my mentor for a couple of years, he's built the visual ARIA bookmarklet, which is kind of the first attempt at displaying how ARIA is working in the browser. And that's great. We've been playing around with it, and that helps our designers when they're designing their new templates and building complex prototypes and such. And I'm really excited to see where that is going, and I want to see that integrated into more validation tools. So this is my conclusion. I actually have another 10 slides where I go into a lot more detail about things that are awkward in the standard and the assistive technology support and where we could be headed in the future. So if people want me back for that part, and if you really want to stay up till midnight, we all love accessibility, so why not? We could cover that later or at some other point in time, which I prefer because it's 7 o'clock. But basically, I hope people have enjoyed it. I tried to tie it back here to the first slide. I use another shot from movie Independence Day. Instead of the aliens trying to destroy New York City, we actually have fended them off. And it's a poor metaphor, but kind of, if you do ARIA correctly, we can turn it around and we can make it awesome. And we can really do what it's supposed to do, and that is to help people with disabilities who use assistive technologies really celebrate their digital independence. That's why I got into this business in the first place, because I want full control of my own finances. I want to study whatever I want. I want to do whatever I want with technology. I want to make sure the technology allows it. And ARIA is definitely a key component in making that possible. And just like to then close out my presentation by thanking all 3 of you who attended, hopefully more. And I'm totally open for any questions. And I am planning to write a blog post on this where I provide links to working and not working examples so you can peruse that in more detail and enjoy it, hopefully.
So, Birkir, this is Matt. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, good.
Excellent. So how are you doing? Great job today.
Thank you.
So one of the questions I had was, or comments, and based on what I heard, it's really interesting how the impact to the user is drastic when, there's this much, let's use the word extra coding, it sounds like.
Yeah.
That, the user is going to hear a lot more noise, potentially be confused. And it sounds like people are overusing ARIA or misusing ARIA to the point that they're making it harder for the user, not easier.
Unfortunately, yes, absolutely. If ARIA is used incorrectly, it can do as much damage as, even more damage than good ARIA can improve the user experience. And unfortunately, people think that just using ARIA by itself means that you're accessible. No, you have to use it correctly to be accessible.
One of the things that I find more and more is that folks are actually adding full description and instructions in their labels rather than leaving it to the user to, we're almost assuming that the user's not smart enough to do it themselves. Would that be accurate, that people are kind of, like you gave an example earlier, it said in the label, it said press enter or something like that, or please enter your name.
Yeah, unfortunately, when people think of the screen reader experience, they think a screen reader is only going to read what you can put focus on, which means you either make everything focusable, which means every paragraph on your web page, or you associate so much using ARIA described by, you associate lines and lines of text with a single input field, and it's impossible to read, basically. So this is another one of why developers should not create the blind experience. We don't expect a blind person to drive a car or design a living room. So this is why we have to have a better, more open conversation and not have the developers overdo it.
Well, this is great. Gene or
Johnny,
do we have any questions?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, I have actually. It's all good, man. It's all good.
I almost called you by your nickname, so I had to stop there.
Thanks for restraining yourself, Matt.
Well, we do have a question from Twitter, which is, what types of issues does the validator identify and how do they affect accessibility? And that was from Sarah Horton.
It really depends on the validator. And this is in the extra, what I call addendum slides. I didn't go into it in any detail and knew I wouldn't have the time. But some validators really try to evaluate that ARIA is used correctly. So if you use a tab, you know you have to use ARIA selected to indicate the selected tab. If you use, say, ARIA pressed, a smart validator can say, this is never going to be announced to a screen reader because the ARIA pressed attribute is only valid with a button roll. So some software, particularly the Axe open source tool, which my former colleagues at DQ have been developing, it's beginning to do a very good job of at least trying to explain where ARIA is used incorrectly. It can flag obvious things like when an interactive element has a static role, like I explained, when a button element is mapped as a heading, that is a violation of the spec. But it's not, it's not, I don't know, we need a little more clarification in the standard of a couple of things before the validators can really implement it correctly. And this is, again, in the set of slides that we didn't cover today. But and also, there's quite a few validators out there just say, either don't care about ARIA and just say, oh, I don't think about ARIA, or just display a warning if ARIA is used and say it's an error. We really need a smarter set of tools that, yes, you can warn users that using a button roll is unnecessary, but if they do it, you have to make sure they do it correctly, at least semantically. So yes, a validator can help a lot. It can track a lot of issues, but the main problem that's really hard to validate, and that's what makes accessibility testing so much more complicated today, is if you have a roll equals button, it's really hard to make sure that it looks like a button, it acts like a button, and it has all the keyboard listeners that are expected. That is what automated tools are just not really good at, and we need to find better ways to evaluate that.
That's awesome. Birkir, I have a bit of a, I don't know, it's a bit of a fun question, or maybe not, but if you could get rid of one ARIA attribute, which would it be? I feel like this is one of those like dating questions. It's like, you got the 3 bachelors and then the woman, who's looking at it now. But this
it's a great question. It's a great question, though, Johnny.
It really is. It is.
I want 3 things because, I want to date the supermodel there. First, I want either the ARIA flow-to attribute is only supported with JAWS and Firefox. It's really cool. It can be a way to point you straight to footnotes and straight back from them. But either it has to be removed from the spec or it has to be supported. It can't have this attribute. That's one of the examples of attributes been sitting out there for years, and they're valid, but they're useless. And I don't want useless attributes in the spec. I want them to be removed or implemented. So kind of the shit, I get off the potty. I have 3 kids, so this is my language. And then what I really want, and people always keep asking me about this, is an error message association like ARIA error message. We talked about it before. But developers want something that doesn't always point to an ID attribute. When you generate pages on the fly, you have an error class. You want to be able to use a query to just say, announce the next element after the form field with this class, instead of having to create an ID attribute, making sure that's unique, inserting and then pointing to it. Developers find that just such a headache, and sometimes that really frustrates them. So if we can find an ARIA attribute that points to something else than an ID attribute, it would be really useful. And yeah, that's really, these are the biggest 2. My third concern is we're creating so many roles that do almost the same thing. We have a toggle button, which is a button that can be pressed or not pressed. Now we have a new role called switch, which can be checked or not checked. And then we have checkbox that can be checked or not checked. I just wish we'd keep it simple and not create too many things that are almost the same, but slightly different, because users and assistive technologies don't understand these differences, and the specs gets really bloated. So simplify.
Yeah. And we probably have time just for one last question, but if you could change one common thing devs do to make things worse with ARIA, what would it be?
Oh, goodness. Just don't use roles whose children are presentational except before you talk with me about it. You can destroy a whole page by putting role equals tab on the body tag. Like, there's too much power. There has to be I don't know. I wish the browser would validate and say, no, no, no. There are focusable elements inside this. You can use this role. I'm going to override it and remove it.
Yeah.
And it's been a big question, and we've always taken the stance that ARIA should not, putting an ARIA role should not cause a browser function to happen. But I almost think there have to be exceptions for these roles that are so powerful that they completely rewrite the web page, destroy it for the users that rely on them. I wish the browser were allowed to step in.
That's awesome. So Birkir, thank you so much, and we would love to have you back because we want to see these mystery 10 slides, these top secret 10 slides that you have that we've kept from people. So
All right.
yeah, we'd love to have you come back, and that was an excellent talk, and we all learned lots of great advice from you. That's amazing.
I'd be happy to be back, and I will tweet out on Twitter with hashtag ID24 when I get around to making this into a blog with actual examples that people can experience. I think that's the full value of it, but I just didn't have the time to finish it.
Excellent. Oh, it's all good.
And be sure to check Twitter because there was some appreciation of your puns in the Twitter sphere.
Yeah, I'm still wondering actually if Curious George was a superhero, what would his superpower be?
Making
Attracted to yellow hats. I don't know.
Oh.
I don't know. My kids are into Pokemon, so I'm trying to find anything that's not Pokemon.
That's
So, this Pokemon has a superpower. It flashes so badly that it sent 600 Japanese children to hospital.
yeah, they're very aware of that.
Yep.
In fact. All right, guys. It was
Excellent.
glad to contribute, and thanks for just hosting such a fantastic event. I want to lay down on Sunday with all these videos and watch them.
Great. Thanks, Birkir. All the best, and cheers.
Cheers.
And for everyone else, come back in 10 minutes for the last hour of ID 24.
Yeah, things are going to get loopy with Denis Boudreau, so come on back.